Everybody has a story to tell. And when it comes to the Whittaker family, that story has been pulled in so many directions that people don't even realize what they're arguing about anymore. Some are arguing law. Some are arguing morality. Some are arguing timelines. And some are arguing personalities. But underneath all of it is a much simpler question that keeps getting dodged. Who actually exploited this family? Because somewhere along the way, the focus shifted almost entirely to Eric. Eric said this. Eric did that. Eric wasn't arrested. Eric is still free. Eric broke up the family. And while there are valid questions about Eric's behavior, something important happened in the noise. Patrick Rohr's role got minimized, blurred, softened, or excused entirely by people who once believed in him. And that's not an accident. Patrick didn't just stumble into this situation. He wasn't dragged along helplessly. He wasn't some quiet bystander who got overwhelmed. Patrick positioned himself as a helper, a fixer, a provider, and a gatekeeper. And now that he's sitting where he is, facing serious charges, it's time to stop pretending his actions were passive. This isn't about hatred. This isn't about cheering for someone's downfall. This is about accountability. And accountability doesn't care who people like more. There's a dangerous myth floating around that if someone hasn't been charged yet, they must be innocent. That's not how the world works. People don't usually get caught the first time they do something wrong. They get caught when patterns catch up with them, when the math no longer works, when too many stories line up the same way, when too many people say, "Wait a minute, Patrick didn't wake up one morning shocked by what happened to him." There are signs he knew the walls were closing in. The silence, the distancing, the lack of action when action mattered. Those aren't traits of someone blindsided. Those are traits of someone waiting. And waiting tells you something about character. Because when someone sees harm happening and does nothing, not because they can't, but because it benefits them not to act, that silence is a decision. And Patrick made a lot of decisions. Let's talk about exploitation without excuses. Exploitation doesn't always look like force. It often looks like friendliness. It looks like "I've got this handled." It looks like "trust me." It looks like controlling access, controlling money, controlling narrative, and controlling who speaks and who doesn't. Patrick didn't just appear around the Whittakers and film a few moments. He became embedded. He accepted donations. He accepted items. He accepted trust. And according to allegations, he accepted things that were never meant for him to keep. If it's true that donated items were sold, that alone tells you everything you need to know. Because that means help was never the goal. The appearance of help was. And here's where people get uncomfortable. Because believing Patrick exploited the Whittakers forces people to confront their own choices. It forces them to admit they trusted the wrong person. It forces them to accept that good intentions don't protect anyone from being used. It's easier to redirect that discomfort onto Eric. Eric is loud. Eric is confrontational. Eric made enemies. Eric went to APS. Eric said things on camera that made people recoil. And yes, Eric bears responsibility. He is not innocent in the moral sense. He played a role in destabilizing that family. He inserted himself where he had no authority. He issued ultimatums he had no right to issue. He treated fragile adults like problems to be solved instead of people to be protected. But here's the difference that keeps getting ignored. Eric's actions were visible. Patrick's were hidden. Eric talked too much. Patrick talked just enough. Eric created chaos openly. Patrick benefited quietly. That matters. Because when the dust settled, it wasn't Eric who was charged with multiple felony counts tied to financial exploitation. It wasn't Eric who was accused of funneling donations through personal channels. It wasn't Eric who allegedly kept money that was meant for incapacitated people. Patrick didn't just stand near exploitation. He profited from proximity to it. And that's why the argument that Eric hasn't been arrested misses the point entirely. Responsibility doesn't start and end with handcuffs. Sometimes it starts with money. Sometimes it starts with silence. Sometimes it starts with watching something wrong happen and choosing not to stop it because stopping it would interrupt your own benefit. Patrick had choices. He could have insisted all donations go through one transparent platform. He could have refused personal payment handles. He could have handed money directly to the family or ensured third-party oversight. He could have stepped back when things became unstable. He didn't. And people need to ask why. Why didn't he set up a single GoFundMe where everything was traceable? Why were there multiple apps, multiple payment methods, multiple streams? Why were donors confused about where their money went? Why didn't the family ever seem financially improved despite all the attention? Those questions don't disappear just because another person behaved badly too. And this is where the conversation has to mature. More than one person can be responsible. More than one person can cause harm. More than one person can exploit a situation differently. Eric may have fractured the family emotionally and structurally. Patrick, according to allegations, exploited them financially. Those are not competing truths. They are connected ones. The most disturbing part isn't even the money. It's the precedent. When exploitation happens under the banner of help, it poisons the ground for anyone who actually needs assistance later. People become suspicious. Donors pull back. Real need gets ignored because someone else already burned that bridge. That damage lasts longer than any arrest. And here's something people don't want to admit. If Patrick truly cared about the Whittakers, the moment he sensed wrongdoing, instability, or legal risk, he would have protected them, not himself. He would have stepped away from control, not tightened it. He would have demanded transparency, not avoided it. Instead, the family ended up split. The house unfinished. The money gone. The trust shattered. And now the story people are left arguing about isn't how to help the Whittakers, it's who to blame. That tells you everything. Because when help is real, the story ends with stability. When help is exploitation, the story ends with chaos and courtrooms. This isn't about piling on Patrick. This is about finally saying the quiet part out loud. He wasn't just adjacent to harm. He was positioned in a way that allowed harm to flow through him. And whether people liked him, believed in him, or once defended him doesn't change that. One of the reasons Patrick's role stayed blurred for so long is because blame has a habit of traveling toward the loudest person in the room. Eric was loud. Eric argued. Eric inserted himself into conversations that weren't his. Eric made threats, ultimatums, and public claims that immediately set people on edge. And when chaos erupts, people instinctively point to the person making the most noise. Patrick benefited from that. While Eric was drawing heat, Patrick was positioning himself as the reasonable one, the calmer one, the one who just wanted to help. That contrast mattered more than people realized, because in situations involving vulnerable families, perception becomes currency. Whoever looks stable gains trust. Whoever looks angry loses it. And Patrick knew how to look stable. He didn't challenge Eric publicly. He didn't contradict him forcefully. He didn't step in to stop the damage when the family was being pushed, pressured, or destabilized. Instead, he stayed close enough to benefit and quiet enough to avoid scrutiny. That's not fear. That's strategy. People keep saying Patrick was intimidated, that he was scared, that he froze. But fear doesn't explain continued involvement. Fear doesn't explain accepting donations. Fear doesn't explain holding on to items that weren't yours. Fear doesn't explain silence when the family was unraveling. Fear makes people retreat. Patrick didn't retreat. He stayed. And staying means choosing. Another reason Patrick avoided early accountability is because exploitation doesn't match people's mental image of a villain. When people imagine someone exploiting a vulnerable family, they picture cruelty, aggression, or obvious abuse. They don't picture friendliness, jokes, or someone who appears generous on camera. But exploitation rarely announces itself. It hides behind access. Patrick had access. Access to the family. Access to donors. Access to the narrative. Access to money streams that weren't visible to the public. And access is power, especially when the people you're surrounding don't understand how systems, contracts, or fundraising work. That's why this case feels so unsettling to people who once supported him. It forces them to confront the idea that harm doesn't always come from the person everyone dislikes. Sometimes it comes from the person everyone trusted. And trust is harder to examine than anger. There's also something else people don't like to talk about. Patrick didn't just benefit financially. He benefited emotionally and socially. Being seen as the helper gave him status. It gave him praise. It gave him defenders. It gave him shield. When someone questioned him, others rushed in to explain it away. He wouldn't do that. He's different. He cares. He's not like Eric. Those statements didn't come from evidence. They came from comfort. And comfort can be dangerous. Because while people were busy debating whether Eric was too aggressive, too controlling, too inappropriate, Patrick's actions stayed largely unquestioned. The focus was always on intention, never on outcome. Always on personality, never on results. But outcomes don't lie. The family didn't end up financially stable. The house didn't end up completed. The money didn't end up clearly accounted for. The family ended up separated. Those are outcomes. And when outcomes consistently contradict intentions, it's time to stop arguing intentions. Another uncomfortable truth is that Patrick's silence after everything fell apart speaks volumes. When innocent people are falsely accused, they fight loudly. They demand clarity. They provide receipts. They welcome scrutiny. They say, "Look at everything. I have nothing to hide." Patrick didn't do that. Instead, he withdrew. He waited. He let others argue on his behalf. He didn't proactively explain where the money went, how items were handled, or why systems weren't in place. That's not how someone behaves when transparency is their ally. That's how someone behaves when time is their ally. And time doesn't help the Whittakers. Time helps people hoping attention fades. People also forget that Patrick wasn't some outsider stumbling into a mess he didn't understand. He was aware of the family's vulnerabilities. He knew they were fragile adults. He knew they relied on others. He knew they didn't have the capacity to manage finances or consent in the way donors assumed. That knowledge increases responsibility. It doesn't excuse mistakes. If anything, it makes alleged exploitation worse. Because when you know someone can't advocate for themselves and you still place yourself between them and resources, you're no longer just helping. You're controlling. And control is where exploitation lives. The argument that Eric caused a split doesn't absolve Patrick of what came next. Even if Eric lit the match, Patrick didn't put out the fire. In fact, it looks more like he warmed his hands by it. And here's the part that makes people defensive. Supporting Patrick once doesn't make anyone stupid. It makes them human. People want to believe that help exists. People want to believe that good intentions lead to good outcomes. People want to believe that compassion is safe. But exploitation thrives on that hope. And the only way to honor the Whittakers now is to stop protecting the people who benefited from their suffering just because admitting the truth feels uncomfortable. Patrick didn't have to be the loudest to be the most damaging. He just had to be positioned correctly. This isn't about piling blame where it doesn't belong. It's about putting blame where it was avoided. Eric disrupted. Patrick exploited. Those two truths can exist at the same time. And if people want to argue innocence, they should argue with evidence, not loyalty. Receipts, records, transparent accounting, documented transfers to the family. That's what clears a name. Not silence. Not deflection. Not pointing at someone else. Because at the end of all this, the the Whitakers are still the ones living with the consequences. They didn't gain stability. They didn't gain protection. They didn't gain peace. They lost each other. And while the internet debates personalities, they're paying the price. What happened to the Whittaker family didn't happen in isolation. That's the part people struggle with because it means this isn't just about one bad actor or one bad decision. It's about a pattern that keeps repeating online, especially when vulnerability meets visibility. And once you recognize that pattern, Patrick's role stops looking confusing and starts looking familiar. This is how it usually begins. A vulnerable family exists quietly, unseen, unsupported, and overwhelmed. Their struggles are real, long-standing, and structural. Poverty, disability, isolation, lack of services. None of it is new. Then someone with access to the internet steps in and reframes that suffering as a story. Not a case file, not a social services issue. A story. Stories attract attention. Attention attracts money. And money, without guardrails, attracts the wrong kind of people. The internet rewards urgency. It rewards emotional reaction. It rewards outrage, shock, pity, and savior narratives. What it does not reward is slow, boring, accountable help. No one goes viral by filing paperwork, coordinating license care, or setting up a fiduciary. But you can go viral by filming someone's worst moments and telling people they can help right now. That's the environment Patrick stepped into. And instead of stopping it, he leaned into it. People often ask why the Whitakers didn't benefit more if so much attention and money were involved. That question misunderstands how exploitation works. Exploitation doesn't require stealing everything. It only requires controlling enough that the person being helped never gains independence, clarity, or power. Keeping people dependent is profitable. If the family had been stabilized properly, if money had gone through transparent systems, if professionals had been involved early, the content would have stopped. The emergency would have ended, and so would the attention. That's why so many online helpers unconsciously resist real solutions. They don't say it out loud, but resolution is bad for engagement. Patrick's alleged behavior fits that model uncomfortably well. He didn't create systems that would outlast him. He didn't create structures the family could control themselves. He inserted himself as the middleman. And middlemen benefit from confusion. Think about it. If everything had gone through one transparent platform with public accounting and third-party oversight, how much power would Patrick have had? Very little. He would have been replaceable. He would have been unnecessary. But when donations go through personal accounts, personal mailing addresses, private arrangements, the helper becomes indispensable. You can't question them without threatening the whole operation. And anyone who does gets framed as hurting the family. That's how accountability gets flipped into cruelty. Another reason this pattern keeps repeating is because audiences are trained to pick sides instead of asking systems-level questions. People argued endlessly about whether Eric was good or bad, loud or manipulative, helpful or destructive. That argument soaked up all the oxygen. Meanwhile, almost no one was asking basic structural questions. Where's the money being held? Who controls it? Who audits it? What happens if this person disappears tomorrow? Those questions aren't exciting, but they're everything. And Patrick was never forced to answer them publicly. This isn't because viewers were stupid. It's because the internet conditions people to react emotionally first and investigate later. By the time doubts surface, loyalty has already formed. People don't want to admit they may have been wrong, especially when their intentions were good. That's where cognitive dissonance sets in. If I supported him and he's bad, what does that say about me? So instead, people say he meant well, or he was manipulated, or at least he tried. Those statements protect the supporter's identity more than they protect the family. But intention doesn't cancel impact. Another uncomfortable layer here is that exploitation often doesn't feel like exploitation while it's happening. It feels like urgency. It feels like chaos. It feels like we're just trying to do something before it's too late. That emotional pressure makes people bypass safeguards they would otherwise insist on. Patrick operated inside that urgency. And when urgency meets vulnerable adults, consent becomes murky. The Whittakers weren't equipped to understand contracts, fundraising mechanics, or the long-term consequences of allowing outsiders to control narratives and resources. That doesn't make them weak. It makes them human in a system that failed them long before cameras arrived. Which brings us to the most painful truth in this part of the story. The state didn't step in because the internet helped too much. The state stepped in because the help was chaotic, unregulated, and potentially harmful. When adult protective services intervenes, it's rarely because a family is suddenly worse than they were before. It's because risk has escalated, and viral attention escalates risk. More people, more interference, more instability, more conflict, more stress. The Whittaker family became a public battleground, and Patrick's alleged exploitation didn't happen in spite of that chaos. It happened because of it. This is why people saying Eric caused everything misses the point. Even if Eric destabilized the environment, Patrick chose to operate within it instead of de-escalating it. He chose proximity to money over distance from harm. He chose access over accountability. That's not passive. That's participation. And here's the part people don't want to say out loud. Exploitation doesn't always end with jail. Sometimes it ends with separation, silence, and systems stepping in too late to undo the damage. The Whittakers didn't just lose money. They lost autonomy. They lost privacy. They lost each other. And they lost control of their own story. That's the real cost. So if there's anything this part of the story should force people to confront, it's this. Charity without structure is not kindness. It's risk. And when vulnerable adults are involved, that risk becomes harm fast. Patrick didn't invent this model, but according to allegations, he used it. And the fact that it worked for as long as it did should alarm everyone, not just the people directly involved. Because the next family is already out there, already vulnerable, already one viral clip away from the same cycle. And unless people stop confusing attention with help, this will keep happening. In the next part, we're going to look directly at responsibility. Not legal guilt, not speculation, but moral responsibility. Who had power, who used it, who failed to stop harm, and who paid the price. And more importantly, what accountability actually looks like when the damage can't be undone. Before you move on, leave a comment and answer this honestly. Do you think online charity helps more people than it harms? Or do cases like this prove it needs serious limits? Responsibility is the word everyone avoids because it doesn't belong to one person. It stretches across choices, silence, timing, and power. And that's why Part 4 matters more than any arrest headline or online argument. Because even if Patrick is held legally accountable, the damage done to the Whittaker family didn't happen in a vacuum, and it didn't require everyone involved to act maliciously. It only required enough people to look away at the wrong moments. Let's strip this down to the uncomfortable basics. Responsibility begins where power exists. Patrick had power, not because he was smarter or stronger, but because he controlled access. Access to money, access to donors, access to the narrative. When someone becomes the gatekeeper between a vulnerable family and the outside world, they inherit responsibility whether they want it or not. You don't get the benefits without the burden. The moment Patrick accepted donations meant for the Whittakers, his role changed. He wasn't a helper anymore. He was a steward. That comes with obligations, clear accounting, separation of personal and donated funds, transparency, and most importantly, safeguards to ensure the family benefits first, not last. According to allegations, those safeguards weren't there. But responsibility doesn't stop with the person holding the money. It extends to the people who allowed that structure to continue unchecked. Here's where things get complicated and where a lot of people get defensive. Audiences have responsibility too. Not legal responsibility, but moral responsibility. When viewers reward content that blurs ethical lines, they reinforce the behavior. When they dismiss legitimate questions as hate or jealousy, they silence accountability. When they say, at least someone is helping, they lower the bar to the floor. Good intentions don't cancel harmful outcomes. The Whittakers weren't harmed because people cared. They were harmed because care became chaotic, emotional, and unregulated. Because viewers were encouraged to feel rather than to verify. Because urgency replaced scrutiny. And because asking hard questions was treated like betrayal. Another layer of responsibility lies with the platform culture itself. Social media doesn't just host content, it shapes behavior. It rewards escalation. It punishes nuance. It amplifies extremes. A calm explanation of fiduciary oversight will never outperform a tearful video promising immediate rescue. So helpers learn quickly. Drama pays, order doesn't. That doesn't excuse behavior, but it explains why exploitation keeps reappearing. People learn what works, even when what works is harmful. Now let's talk about Eric. Not to relitigate every action, but to clarify why responsibility isn't a competition. It is possible for Patrick to exploit and for Eric to destabilize. Those realities can coexist. The need to declare one worse often distract from the fact that both contributed to a system that failed the family. Eric's repeated involvement with adult protective services matters, not because calling APS is inherently wrong, but because of context. When someone inserts themselves repeatedly into a vulnerable family situation, escalates conflict, and frames themselves as the solution, they are exerting influence whether they admit it or not. Influence creates responsibility. Eric didn't need criminal intent to cause harm. He only needed to act without authority, without professional boundaries, and without regard for long-term consequences. Patrick, on the other hand, didn't need to cause the initial chaos. He benefited from it. That's why focusing solely on who started what is a dead end. Harm doesn't require a single villain. It requires misaligned incentives and unchecked power. The Whittaker family was never given a chance to regain control once outsiders enter their lives. Every decision became reactive. Every day became crisis management. That environment is exactly where exploitation thrives. And here's the part that rarely gets said. The state didn't intervene because the family was suddenly worse. The state intervened because the situation became unsustainable. Too many outsiders. Too much money moving without structure. Too much instability layered on top of existing vulnerability. When systems see chaos, they don't sort out who meant well. They remove risk, and the family pays the price. 3 members were removed. 2 were left behind. No clear explanations. No shared plan. Just silence, separation, and the slow collapse of the only life they'd ever known. That outcome didn't require anyone to wake up one morning and decide to destroy the family. It required something far more common. People acting without limits and believing passion was enough. This is where accountability has to mature. Real accountability isn't just punishment after the fact. It's prevention. It's building structures that make exploitation difficult instead of easy. It's refusing to normalize personal fundraising for vulnerable adults. It's demanding third-party oversight. It's understanding that proximity does not equal qualification. And it's accepting that sometimes the most ethical action is to step back. The hardest truth in this part of the story is this. The Whittakers needed less attention and more protection, less urgency and more planning, less savior behavior and more boring, regulated help. But boring help doesn't trend. So the internet chose spectacle, and the family absorbed the consequences. Patrick's alleged exploitation is now facing legal consequences. That's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Because if nothing else changes, another Patrick will appear. Another family will go viral. Another audience will rally. And another disaster will unfold. Responsibility doesn't end with one arrest. It ends when the system changes. In the next part, we're going to talk about what accountability actually looks like moving forward. Not just for individuals, but for platforms, creators, donors, and viewers. And we're going to ask a question that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. If a family can't consent to being filmed, should they ever be content at all? Before continuing, leave a comment and answer this honestly. Do you think good intentions should ever excuse harm when vulnerable people are involved? Or is accountability non-negotiable no matter the motive? If this story has taught us anything, it's that accountability doesn't begin in a courtroom and it doesn't end with an arrest. Accountability begins long before harm becomes visible, and it continues long after headlines fade. And part 5 is where we stop looking backward and start asking what responsibility looks like from here on out for everyone. Because the truth is uncomfortable. The Whittaker family didn't just fall through one crack. They fell through many. They fell through the crack between compassion and control, between attention and oversight, between help and harm. And if we don't confront those gaps honestly, this story will repeat itself with a different family, a different face, and the same ending. Let's talk about consent. Consent is the cornerstone of ethical care. And consent is not just the absence of refusal. It requires understanding, capacity, and freedom from pressure. When people are cognitively impaired, nonverbal, or dependent on others for survival, consent becomes complex. That doesn't mean they lose their humanity. It means the bar for ethical behavior rises, not falls. Filming vulnerable adults for public consumption without clear, documented, informed consent is not awareness. It is exposure. And exposure without protection is exploitation, even when wrapped in kindness. The internet has normalized something deeply dangerous. The idea that suffering is acceptable if it generates sympathy. That humiliation is tolerable if it raises funds. That dignity is negotiable if the outcome feels good. But dignity is not a luxury item. It is not something people earn by being likable or grateful. It is a right. The Whittakers were never positioned to protect their own dignity once outsiders enter their lives. They didn't understand algorithms. They didn't understand monetization. They didn't understand that every moment could be clipped, sold, debated, or weaponized. That responsibility fell on the people who did understand, and too many of them failed. Now let's talk about structure, because structure is what separates help from harm. Real help has paperwork. Real help has limits. Real help has accountability. It doesn't rely on one person's judgment, one person's wallet, or one person's story. It distributes responsibility so no single individual becomes untouchable. The moment donations flow through personal accounts, the moment transparency is treated as optional, the moment questions are framed as attacks, that's when help becomes dangerous. This isn't theoretical. We've seen what happens. Money moved without oversight. Promises were made without authority. Decisions were pushed without consent. And when it collapsed, the family paid the price. That's why the question, who is to blame, is ultimately the wrong one. The better question is, what systems allowed this to happen? Platforms allowed monetization without safeguards. Audiences rewarded emotional manipulation. Creators blurred lines between advocacy and ownership. And institutions reacted only after the damage was done. This doesn't mean no one is responsible. It means responsibility is shared, and shared responsibility requires shared reform. So what does reform look like? First, vulnerable adults should never be fundraised for without independent oversight. Ever. If someone truly wants to help, they partner with established organizations, social workers, legal guardians, or verified nonprofits. They don't reinvent the wheel with a camera and a payment app. Second, filming should never be a condition of care. If help requires exposure, it's not help, it's a transaction. And vulnerable people cannot ethically be used as currency. Third, donors need to slow down. Emotional urgency is the oldest manipulation tactic in the book. The more rushed you feel, the more careful you should be. Ask where the money goes. Ask who controls it. Ask what protections exist if something goes wrong. If those questions are treated as hostility, walk away. And finally, we need to confront something uncomfortable about ourselves as viewers. We say we want to help, but often what we really want is resolution. A clean ending. A hero. A villain. Closure. Real life doesn't work like that. Sometimes the most ethical outcome looks unsatisfying. It looks like silence. It looks like privacy. It looks like not knowing everything. The fact that we no longer see certain members of the Whittaker family may be frustrating, but it may also be the first time their lives are not being consumed by strangers. That doesn't erase the pain of separation. It doesn't undo the harm already done, but it does challenge us to rethink what following a story should mean when real people are involved. The Whittakers are not content. They are not lessons. They are not symbols. They are people who lived for decades without protection, were suddenly overwhelmed by attention, and then lost control of their own narrative. If this chapter of their story leads to anything meaningful, it should lead to restraint. Restraint in what we share. Restraint in what we fund. Restraint in what we demand access to. Because the line between helping and hurting is thinner than most people want to admit. And once it's crossed, intentions don't matter anymore. Patrick's alleged exploitation is now in the hands of the legal system. That process will play out as it should. But the larger reckoning belongs to all of us. Will we continue rewarding chaos dressed up as care? Or will we insist on systems that protect the most vulnerable? Even if it means fewer videos, fewer updates, and less drama? That's the real choice this story leaves behind. Before you leave, I want you to comment with one thing. Not a name, not an accusation, not a rumor. Answer this instead. What boundary do you think should never be crossed when helping a vulnerable family online? Because if we don't define those boundaries now, someone else will cross them later, and another family will pay the price. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.